Excellent. It's just setting up and broadcasting. I'll hit record. Hello, hello, delicious humans. Anyone who's coming on early as Facebook loads up. Welcome everyone to our final speaker here today for the Superhuman Summit. It has been amazing, hasn't it, everyone? It has been a joy to bring this summit to all of you. I know Michelle and I, this is the second time we've done a summit this year, and we are constantly blown away by the generosity of beautiful people like Jonathan, who's in front of you here, who have generously given us of their time and their expertise and their knowledge. And we're also blown away by all of you who have been watching throughout, and particularly when you're commenting and sharing and asking questions and all those sorts of things, because it really supports us and the speakers to make this as interactive as possible. And despite what's happened with COVID and the fact that we can't travel and go to conferences and be live in a room, we can still feel connected to each other. And the beauty of this is you get to ask questions of the speakers if you're on live, and you can actually interact with them. And we've really had an international lineup for this summit this year. We have had people speaking to us from Hong Kong, France, England. We've had America, USA, New Zealand, as well as Queensland. We call the Queenslanders here in Australia as if they're from another country. And now we've got Jonathan coming all the way from Norway. So over in the other side of the world, it is evening for us here in Australia, and good morning to you, Jonathan.
Good morning or evening to you, AJ, and thanks for the hosting. And thanks to also, I just want to say thanks to Michelle for reaching out and contacting me and inviting me for this. I feel honored to be invited to share some experiences and reflections over the next while. My plan is to just kind of tell some stories and perspectives for about half an hour, and then invite questions, and that's always more fun.
Fantastic. And so people, you're welcome, whether you're in Facebook land or here in Zoom with us, you're welcome to post your questions or comments along the way. I'll be fielding those and collecting those. And then after Jonathan's done some sharing, we will dive into any of those if you have them. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about Jonathan and why Michelle reached out to him. He practices the cultivation of leadership through awareness-based consulting. Ooh. So that's really interesting. He also does a lot of coaching and leadership development in a variety of settings. He's also has a position at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, I believe, and has been an editor on a journal, the Integral Review. He does all sorts of things, co-founder of the European Centre for Leadership Practice and Centre for Transformative Leadership. I love the fact that it's just leadership, 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 because this is my jam. This is what I love. And I think I say, you know, organizations and leaders really can be the problem solvers for many of the world's problems that we're facing right now and the challenges that we face. And so complexity is our life and our world. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us today, Jonathan. And I know your topic is the science and spirit of leadership. So super pumped to dive right in. Why don't I hand over to you and let you take it away?
Great. Thanks a lot, AJ, for the intro. I'm going to start with a little bit of background and context for how I got to where I am. Then I'll talk a little bit about how I experienced the nature of the dance between science and spirituality. And that will lead me into some comments about how I view leadership and understand it. So 40 years ago, I attended a talk and I can't remember who the speaker was, but they made a comment that they gave a definition of spirit, basically, and it stuck with me. And he said that spirit is always becoming more than itself. And this was something that seemed very elegantly simple, like almost like a Zen koan. How is this so simple of a definition? How is it going to unfold in my life? So to put that a bit in context, I would talk a little bit about what I could almost call my kind of spiritual awakening, you could say. So I grew up in a very conservative Protestant upbringing. My father was the president of the church council, and I did all these good things. But I remember when I was 12 venturing out to some vacation Bible schools for other religions, because I was curious about what did other people think. And there was this young man who was coming around to our table after we were cleaning up in the evening from one event. And he said, "Have you accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior?" And in that moment, it's kind of like time stood still for me. And I was very kind of introjected into myself. And I was looking around and I was thinking, well, I know all the catechism, I know all these things, but I can't find anything that actually connects to in me. And it was a bit terrifying, actually. So I immediately got rid of the guy by going, "Oh, no, I belong to the church down the road. I'm fine. You don't need to save me." But it started something in me. It started a kind of wandering and a curiosity and a quest. And while that led to many different things, about 7 years later, I was out on my own. I was, dropping out of university. I'll talk about that in a moment. And I came to a book discussion for a spiritual practice, and I sat down and they started talking, and it was like the hairs went up on the back of my neck. And then I remembered all those things I hadn't found 7 years ago suddenly were flooding in and present. And part of this, the resonance that this had for me was seeing that the concept was that we are soul, we are spiritual beings having human experiences. And that perspective helped me make this transition. So I dropped out of university. I was studying physics and philosophy and logical positivism, and I just was starting to gag from this highly intellectually abstract way of looking at things. But then I took up the spiritual practice, and 12 years later, after a lot of experiences that helped me have some realization in a very practical sense of what being a spiritual being, having human experiences really meant and looked like, and allowed me to do some work on myself. You could say I wasn't ready for prime time. I had a lot of things to do, a lot of cleaning up and self-discipline. And when I went back to school 12 years later, I thought, well, how can I take this kind of spiritual understanding and make it useful in the world, build bridges into things to do that I could make a living. So, I was a carpenter, I worked on farms, I had a dump truck, I did all these kind of things to make a living. But there was this kind of dichotomy or gap between my worlds. There was the kind of rigorous spiritual practice and inquiry on one side and this kind of making a living on the other. And somehow I wanted to bring these together. And returning to university after 12 years since I dropped out helped me start to take that and explore things. So I read, for instance, everything of William Blake, mystic English literature, different philosophical teachers over history who had brought out these more esoteric perspectives. But a real turning point came when I got tired of doing correspondence and visited a couple of universities in the Northwest of the United States. And one advisor there was saying, well, you can finish your bachelor's degree like this and you can do that and that'll all be fine. And he said, but we have this new master's in organizational leadership you might be interested in. And this booming voice in my head said, do that. And it was a real clear call to shift and say, okay, well, I guess that's what I'm going to do. And I want to say, life shows up and meets you when you need it. And I spent the next 8 years at this university, a Jesuit school, very deep, rigorous, and engaged professors. And they had a master's in organizational leadership, but also a PhD in leadership studies. And by the time I got into that track, I was really clear what I wanted to do. I was studying consciousness through the Journal of Consciousness Studies listserv, Quantum Approaches to Consciousness conference online 20 some years ago. and studying leadership. And so I wrote my PhD on the consciousness of transpersonal leadership. And for me, it was a way of trying to understand how can the rigor of science improve the rigor of my spiritual practice. And so that brings me to the kind of second part of my conversation here, or the talking part of it. And I want to talk a little bit about what I see as the nature of the dance between science and spirituality. Because this is often experienced as a tension. There's the spiritual side of us, the heart, and then there's the kind of intellectual side of us, the head. And, you know, the two are often in conflict or in tension, because should we trust the heart or should we believe the evidence and the reason that our head has? And I was fortunate to encounter a number of people living in British Columbia, spending some time in the San Francisco Bay Area, going to different conferences on consciousness and so on. So one talk we had, a guy named Charlie Tart, who was one of the founders of transpersonal psychology, came up and spoke, and he talked about this tension between science and spirituality. Now, Charlie had done things like being the auditor for the US government on psychic research that Stanford University was doing. And so how to bring real rigor to that was really important. And he said that third-rate spirituality and third-rate science are always in conflict. But first-rate science and first-rate spirituality always find alignment. And this was something that helped me understand.
I love that. I love that so much. So first-rate science and first-rate spirituality find alignment. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. And there is, you see evidence of this with many different people. So I also got to meet Peter Russell. He is somebody who studied physics originally, had Stephen Hawking as his advisor at one point, but then went off to India, got into transcendental meditation, came back and did the first clinical lab PhD research on transcendental meditation.
Wow.
And then got into writing things about science and spirituality and understanding how consciousness can be seen as light, how it inhabits everything down to minerals, you know, has some form of consciousness, but doing that in a rigorous scientific way.
And if you think about it, Einstein was a bit like that too, because Einstein, you know, he wasn't just all about the theory of relativity. He was also a bit of a yogi and a meditator. And he said he often got his formulas and some of his insights after he'd been in a deep meditative trance-like state. Yeah.
And people like Nikola Tesla is famous for designing experiments and setting them off to work in a kind of dream state, and then coming back a week later to check on them and take them apart and learn from them to build his inventions. So there's many examples of that.
Yeah.
Another person I got to be friends with was Amit Goswami. So some people may be familiar with the movie from about 15 years ago, What the Bleep Do We Know?, which is a very interesting documentary. And so Amit is the Indian physicist, and I got to know him about 20 years ago. And what he had was, you know, he was a
movie.
Yeah. So he had studied quantum physics quite deeply, but understood there were, for instance, a number of elements in the equations. You had to have this little sign, and some people called it consciousness, but some people didn't want to. And what do you do with this? And he said he was at a Krishnamurti lecture and came across something that stimulated him. And he suddenly had this insight that what if you flipped the starting assumption? Instead of saying matter is the ground of reality and consciousness somehow emerges out of matter, out of our neurons firing in our brain, what if you say consciousness is primary? And he actually literally did the math. It took him 3 years, but was able to resolve many of these paradoxes in quantum physics by taking a different starting position. And the same kind of thing, for instance, happened in neuroscience. Mario Beauregard did a lot of research trying to understand mystical experience, and was able to get some nuns to actually kind of have mystical experiences while they were in an fMRI machine. And when he wrote about this in a book called The Spiritual Brain, what he did a good job of is saying there's lots of research about is it a point in the brain? Is it localized? Is it this? Is it that? And says it really depends upon the point of view you look from. And this is the key thing. If you take a spiritual starting position, you can actually explain the science in a rigorous scientific way, that it has to do with these underlying kind of cosmological frameworks that we have. So this is part of how I've experienced this dance with science and spirituality. And a key component of this for myself is if I think of the kind of spiritual soul realm and the mental intellectual realm, one of the key differences you could say is that in science, we often look to define things, to pin them down and hold them firm and say, this is what this is. And any kind of definition is inherently static, as where spirit always becoming more than itself is dynamic. It's an ongoing process. So one of my favorite influences, a physicist as well named David Bohm, who was, Einstein considered him his intellectual heir. His dissertation was signed off by Robert Oppenheimer as part of the Manhattan Project. He created the field of plasma physics. He wrote the best textbooks on quantum mechanics and then challenged the Copenhagen interpretation, and spent 15 years in conversation with Jiddu Krishnamurti, integrating kind of Western views of science with Eastern mysticism. And one of the things, one of the phrases that he quoted was, he said, I don't know what I am. What I am is unknown, but constantly revealing itself. And this is this notion of, he said, when we have an identified sense of being, it tends to reify, to become static. We tend to defend it. We want to justify our opinions and perspectives. And these are the kind of things that lead to conflict and egocentric views on things, all of this, as we're a creative, constantly unfolding sense of being, self-transcendence in a sense, is something that gives us a much more dynamic, life-infused way to engage things.
And doesn't that make you think about nature and relationships and everything, that if we take that definition science view and try and pin everything down as static, that's when it gets rigid and it's more likely to snap when something doesn't fit with our worldview. But that concept of spirit being dynamic, just like nature or the weather or whatever, that if we're allowing ourselves to flex with that, who knows where we could expand and end up. I like that real definition and contrast. Yeah.
And it's also this thing of, the mind is a great servant, but a poor master.
Mm.
And of course, the challenge is, how do you connect with something more than the mind? Mm. How do you ground yourself? So Bohm got a lot into the notion of insight as something beyond the system of thought. And thought was not just intellectual abstraction, but a very holistic, integrated kind of the thoughts, the emotions, the physiology, the actions, all of this is kind of one integrated whole. His view of physics, he used the metaphor of a hologram to try and explain how he saw what physics showed, which was really unbroken wholeness. And that it's only our mind's inability to grasp wholeness that leads to the kind of fragmentation. But when we allow that fragmentation to be treated as reality, we then step out of this.
Or when we attach or associate too much with a fragment, right? Then we lose sight of that bigger picture and that it's all in together. Yeah.
Yeah. So from all of this, I have to, being in an academic position, and part of the coin of the realm is publishing in academic journals, and I edit a journal as well. So I came up with, I tried to, let's say, not a definition, but a description. And so I have kind of two things that I've worked on over time. One is to say that soul is a creative unit of pure awareness. Now, at the same time, then we have to think, what is awareness?
Can you repeat that for us?
Sure.
A soul.
Soul is a creative unit of pure awareness.
Ooh. Let that land in, everyone.
But what is awareness? This is the question. And so this took a lot of kind of digging, and I have articles that I've published that you can find on my website that dig deeply into this. So I was trying to think, how can we understand, because many people talk about awareness, consciousness, this, that, you know, how do you really make some distinctions and understand what this is? So the way I ended up describing it is that awareness is the experiential realization of the virtuality of self. Now, there's a lot to unpack there.
That was a mind pretzel. I'm going.
Yeah, well, part of a 40-page article where I have a lot of things that went into coming to that and building up the pieces of it. But it's really saying that when you get to later stages of development, and I'll talk about ego development and skill theory development and that in a bit in relation to leadership, when you get to those later places, you start to see that the self is actually constructed out of, you know, mental imagery or perceptions from others or all these things. The self is a constructed entity. It doesn't necessarily have an ontological reality, but it doesn't mean we don't experience very real things through it. And so trying to understand how could we capture the nature of the experience as soul of a self in the human form, to say that it's a virtual entity. And when we come to a very experiential, not just intellectual, but experiential realization of that, this is what awareness is. And soul is then a creative unit of that pure awareness. So now I should talk a little bit about leadership, because that was ostensibly the topic.
Sounds great. We're following.
So, yeah. So for me, I think, you know, why is leadership important? So it's central in many things in life. One is leading our own lives. You know, self-leadership is where things start. As we often say, regime change begins at home. We have a real need to be able to manage and regulate ourselves so that how we show up for others in the world can be of service. We also, in that sense, have to take responsibility for how we relate with others, and then the impact we have on the larger world. Everything we do has an impact. It's the, you know, the chaos theory and the butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil causing a tornado in Texas or something like this. So when trying to conceive of leadership, I wrote about this in my dissertation research. You know, there's many ways. I have a colleague in Australia who's writing her PhD now, and I'm helping co-supervise that. And she's done literature reviews and said there's about, depending upon who you talk to, 66 or 96 different theories of leadership. So there's many ways of talking about it, which will depend on many things. I was looking for something simple, and what I came up with was that leadership is opening space. And what do I mean by that? So there's many kinds of space. So there's physical spaciousness. I like to live where I have a view. I have a nice view of, well, it's still dark out, but you know, there's mountains and a little village out there and a ski hill and a river, and having this kind of sense of spaciousness physically. We know that when we're kind of too tight, it feels psychically. I had a friend from Los Angeles that came to visit where I lived in Canada, in British Columbia, where we had 100 kilometers of wilderness behind the house and no other people that you could see. And she said, oh, it was so amazing for her. And it wasn't just the physical spaciousness, it was also the lack of psychic smog. So there's something about when you're too kind of tight with people and there's too much kind of emotional energy leaking and all these kind of things, it creates this lack of space, and you feel this kind of smog filling in the psychic energy around you.
Because I was curious, I know I've heard the term probably more from the coaching perspective about holding the space for people, you know, creating a safe space and then holding the space for them to have realization. But I hadn't really heard of opening the space or even thinking about it energetically like that. Yeah, or physically.
Yeah. Well, holding space is, of course, very central. People like Ronald Heifetz's notions of adaptive leadership are built around Winnicott's notion of creating a holding environment where people can do difficult work of questioning assumptions and tensions and these kind of things. And so there's a big part of leadership that involves holding that. And for me, opening includes the holding, but opening also implies this spirit always becoming more than itself. So that there is a way in which opening is a constant dynamic process. If you're standing still, the world's moving beyond you. So there's also other elements of this. So, you know, Amy Edmondson writes about psychological safety, and there's a lot of research on high performing teams that say this is the first thing. If you don't have this kind of way in which your natural fight or flight instincts are kind of calmed, then part of your attentional focus is always on the lookout for danger. And so psychological safety and creating those kind of spaces, opening that up, has a lot to do with many things. So for instance, I've been involved with the Institute of Heart Math and the neurocardiological research, where they have found that, you know, the brain in your heart produces an electromagnetic field 5,000 times stronger than that of the brain, and it can be physically measured 10 feet away. And so there is a way in which we are emanating a field that people can sense, and it will have an impact on their sense of psychological safety. Another important component of this opening space is this conceptual clarity.
I love the heart math, and I love that there's some research. Sorry, I think the internet went a bit wobbly. I was into heart math and also into monks and Buddhist monks who were, they measured their electromagnetic field of their heart space from all of their meditative practices and their compassion and forgiveness that they practice. And the radiation of their heart, I guess you could say, was the space for their countries. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and this is a key element of, there is this energetic space that has this psychological, emotional impact. So, you know, you can sometimes walk into a room and somebody's in charge and you just feel calm, or you just feel on edge. There's ways in which we're always sensing that. But another
and in a way, you could even say micromanaging is an invasion of space. You know, that constant dipping into your space almost. Yeah. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, very much. I think we have a little bit of lag, so that's okay. But there's another component, because we're still very much meaning-making creatures. And so we work, you know, with conceptualizations. And in leadership, part of the job is also to create a certain amount of conceptual clarity. And so you can actually open up space by talking and communicating in a way that brings this kind of clarity that people can start to see and understand the challenges in front of them. You can often help reframe challenges so that people, you know, turn a problem into an opportunity, all these kind of things. But this is part of how you create conceptual clarity as part of opening space. And the last one I would want to link to this is notions of learning and development. You open spaces for learning. So I'm deep into reading Piaget at the moment and really trying to understand, how does learning and development happen? And it's fascinating stuff, and I can't get too deep into it now because I'm really just kind of on the learning curve in many ways. But one of the things that came to me early in studying leadership was encountering people like Robert Keegan and Bill Torbert, Suzanne Cook-Greuter, came across Ken Wilber as he was forming the Integral Institute. And so I became aware of notions of ego development, also became aware eventually of skill theory and dynamic skill development. And the impact of these on leadership is enormous. So there is tons of research that shows that, and you talked about this earlier, you know, we're often talking about the complexity of our modern day world and all the challenges we face. And there is multiple things I noticed in the list of talks. Richard Clayton was talking about, you know, we can't face the problems with a single mind. We need kind of collective intelligence. And yet we are often, you know, in a position where individually we need to up our game. We need to learn from these challenges to be able to take a greater scope of considerations and perspectives into account. We also need to be able to get more granular, to understand, not just in broad, gross generalities, but understand what does this look like in this context for this person. And so part of these notions of ego development and maturity really look at how do our meaning-making structures, not necessarily the content of what we think or believe, but the way we structure and organize that meaning, how does that evolve and mature? How is it always becoming more than itself? And in the same way, I've learned that skill theory, which looks at skills in a very, again, holistic way, that one of the key skills, for instance, is emotion regulation, that we have to understand that our attention is guided by affect. What catches us emotionally is what gets our attention. And being able to have some degree of regulation of that so that we don't react in a triggered kind of way, but are able to somehow have a more, how do I say, is both diffuse and focused kind of presence and attention. Non-judgmental awareness is good for this because it kind of holds us away from judgments so that we can just see what is coming in a more clear way.
And I like that description. I often will say to leaders, the visual for that is to move your hands out until you can just see them in your peripheral. And so it is that kind of diffuse attention.
Yeah. So then there's another component. So while leadership is often about complexity, some friends of mine did a study of political leaders and analyzed speeches they'd given, or interviews, actually, not speeches because those are written for them often, but interviews to look at the cognitive complexity. I think some Australian leaders were done. There's a link to that, as well as Trump and Obama, Clinton and Bush. So there is something very much about that complexity is important, but I find there's also an element more important in terms of leadership, and that has to do with kind of cleaning up our shadows and or the moral element. So we can think very complexly about really stupid or evil things. In Norway, we had an incident 9 years ago now. A guy named Anders Breivik was a mass murderer. He bombed the parliament buildings and then went off to an island and machine gunned 77 kids who were on a retreat. It was horrific. It shocked the nation. And you think this is a really stupid person, but some people that I know analyzed his writings and found out he is actually a very complex thinker. But what he was doing was justifying a set of very kind of deeply wounded shadow kind of beliefs and building very complex rationalizations and justifications for them. So one of the references or resources I use a lot for this is the Arbinger Institute's work, where it's very clear that there is a way in which we are called to act by the light within others. The beingness of others invites us to act, to be helpful in some way. And so if we act on that, great. We're leading, we're acting in service, all these things. But if we don't, then we betray ourselves. And in that act of betrayal, it kind of generates a fog, and we deceive ourselves, and we start to need to justify that deception. And we do this in a relational way. So they talk about collusion, which is, to me, another way of talking about karma. You know, we make judgments on other people's behavior, but we don't recognize that part of that is about our own choices not to see them as people, but we see them as objects. We then judge them, we act on those judgments, and that has an impact on those people. And therefore, they do more things that reinforce our judgments. And we create these vicious cycles, and finding ways to step out of that and having our heart at peace. So in this way, if I was to summarize what I see as the kind of lessons from leadership, it's that leadership is a beingness and acts of soul that enable us to become more than ourselves. We gain these lessons to refine and purify our being in the world, our human experience, through spirit always becoming more than itself. So that's about as much as I want to say on my own. Then I'm sure we're happy to have some questions and comments and ad lib from there.
Wow, thank you, Jonathan. And some great references and ideas and concepts shared there. There was quite a richness. I've taken notes, as you can see, because I'm like, ooh, that's someone I have to look into. William Blake. All right. So I've been writing down ideas and things. I love the idea of the soul as a creative unit of pure awareness. And that self-leadership, you know, that whole idea of leadership beginning at home. I want to invite anyone who's watching or listening on Facebook or here in Zoom to feel free to comment or ask questions. I know someone said along the way, there's a question here. Let me just, firstly, someone's commenting that they love the expression soul is a creative unit, of pure awareness that is then capable of undergoing realistic experience. However, when we look at connectedness, then the unit is just dissolved. All realistic experiences are just illusions. Wow, they loved that concept. We have a question here from Padma, which is fragmenting is a convenient way for us to understand. It helps us to understand stimulus and provide an appropriate response as leaders. When we discount fragmenting and look at everything as dynamic and quantum, how do leaders know when to respond to a stimulus? Interesting question.
Yeah, it's a good question indeed. And I think what I try to listen into with something like that is, you know, what is in between the lines, what is behind. One of my philosophy professors introduced something that I found very helpful, and that was there's two ways to deal with an argument. There's to question the logic or to challenge the assumptions. And then I went, oh, I can question the assumptions, and that's what I do most of the time now. So in coming to this, this notion of stimulus and response, I was having a conversation with somebody last week, and he was talking about the distinction, and this was in relation to Jean Piaget, between how behavioralists tend to look at this, that they look at stimulus and response, Pavlovian conditioning, these kind of things. So they say that the infant is getting stimulus coming to it, and it responds or reacts to the stimulus. But Piaget took a very different way and said the infant is always trying to act on its universe in what, you know, it may be very small at first, but it's acting on it. It's always trying to go out and see what happens. And so this is this perspective shift. So yes, there are things going on out in the world. And one of the practices that I've had to adopt is, how do I not get overwhelmed by the sheer futility of trying to make a difference, or how stupid people can be, or how, whatever it is. And that can be very disheartening and hard to kind of respond in a good way. Um, so the part about fragmentation, I think it's not to discount it for me, is to recognize the contextual limits of fragmentation. So we know that we are inherently seeing the world through our senses in a fragmented way. If you think you're seeing the world as it is, then you are allowing the fragment you're taking the illusory fragment as a reality, and that creates a whole different set of dynamics and problems. And then it is this thing that if you're understanding things are dynamic, then you can see a given fragment, a given conceptualization, a given schema or mental model, a given action as, for that moment, the best that somebody or some group could do, given their resources, given how they understand things. It is the best that people can do. And they could always do better. If you gave them a moment to sit and reflect, people would always find things they would like to change and could do better. And so it's taking that fragment and seeing that it has the possibility to evolve. So I don't know if that answered the question, but it's how I respond to something like that. And I see Niall is asking, how do we make these complex ideas accessible to a mass audience?
That's
That's
$1 million
what I'm trying to do.
Come on summits like this and share your ideas.
Yeah,
and I guess
go ahead.
I was going to say share, the recording of this, but some of the references and information that you've shared, beginning to talk about these things in workplaces and when we're looking at leaders and politicians and everything else.
So last Friday, I was giving a talk for an event in Stockholm, or a global event, but it was online. And they are also trying to get this out. So one of their agendas is to get inner growth or development to be discussed in the same way gender equity and sustainability are, and to be as part of the UN's global goals. So I put a link to my website where you can see lots of overly complex stuff I've written, and a few talks like this. This Mindshift event, though, is, in response to Niall's question, an attempt by people to find ways to get business leaders. So there were many business leaders, Spotify, Ericsson, H&M. These are people who are trying to take these ideas and say, how do we enable our people, not just our employees even, but our customers and clients, to grow as people, that we recognize that for us to thrive as a business, as a community, we need to have everybody growing. We need to also pay attention to these inner dimensions of our lives. And this is a message that's getting out there. The main Swedish newspaper did a big full-page editorial on this topic of bringing inner growth and adult development into public discourse.
Awesome. That's great to hear. And I know there's some links there. I've just been popping them in the Facebook group so that
good.
Over in Facebook.
So what is the Facebook group saying? What's going on there?
People have been more reiterating some of the things that you've been saying, like they like some of your concepts, such as the simplicity and the complexity. Leadership is a beingness, that the spirit is always becoming more than itself. So yeah, they've been more interacting with just liking some of the things you've been saying along the way. So I guess in summary, people can contact you there on your website, get involved with you there. LinkedIn, I believe, is a good way to connect with you as well.
Yes, I'm not a Facebook guy. I don't do Facebook, but I do LinkedIn, so that is possible. I can put a link to that. in here. Let's see,
Amazing.
how do I find my own profile? I got to figure that out. There we go. Yeah, my website has a bunch of stuff on it that for the curious. Happy to take connections on LinkedIn or emails.
Thank you. And I think in summary, as our final speaker of today and of the whole summit, and we will be kind of wrapping up in a moment, but this whole idea of the dance between science and spirituality that you talked about before, and that often there's conflict or tension. But I think all of our speakers, no matter what area they've come from, have really more suggested that they can intertwine and we can have a meeting of two, and rather than having tension, that it's this beautiful unification of when the two come together and we have alignment, how much further we can go as the human race.
And I think this is kind of like a Zen koan. It is, what is experienced early on as huge polarities that never come together, but gradually you start to learn they're just two aspects of the human continuum, and they're actually pointing to the same thing. One of the early books that I read that did this was Fritjof Capra's The Tao of Physics, showing that statements physicists made and statements Buddhist monks made about reality, you couldn't tell which was which at times. Because the language they would use, once you really dove deep into human inquiry and understanding the nature of reality, whether it's through spirituality or science, each of these simply become pathways into this greater unity. So David Bohm's thing that the universe is an undivided wholeness.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's that whole concept that I mentioned before that Charlotta, one of our earlier speakers, talked about. The cosmos is like a giant glitter ball and that, we're all just tiny little fragments of this larger glitter ball that's floating through space and reflecting everywhere and reflecting on itself. And so it's been a delight to have you as one of our little facets of our glitter ball that has been our 3-day summit. I want to wrap up by firstly thanking our behind the scenes team. So we have an amazing team, Michelle Trimble, we've got Vanessa, and we've got so many people that have been doing work behind the scenes. Jenny, all of you, thank you so much for all the work that you do, because it's not just Michelle and I as co-hosts that you see in person on here. Marissa, everyone who's done work behind the scenes, thank you guys for your social media stuff, for interacting, for coordinating the speakers, for organizing us, because Michelle and I need some organizing, let me tell you. And so thank you to you ladies for all the work that you do behind the scenes. Thank you to Marlon and Steve-O as well, who are always amazing cheer squads for us and hold a lot of space and energy, as we just heard Jonathan talking about. So much gratitude to our back-end teams. I also want to just quickly mention and thank all of our speakers, Jade, Richard, Enrique, Anuraj, Casey, Alexis, Jeff, Charlotta, Sally, Ekaterina, Constantine, Christina, Marty, Becky, Belinda, Marie, Michelle, and you as well, Jonathan. Thank you all for generously donating your time and your expertise and your experience, because that's what makes these kind of summits phenomenal. It is the opportunity that we have to connect globally to each other and to do our little piece to just lift and raise consciousness, maybe one more notch or so through coming together. It doesn't end here. The Superhuman Summit is alive and kicking on the Facebook group. Sorry about that, Jonathan. I know you're not a Facebook man, but we do have a whole group over there. And all of these recordings will be there for you to go and delve into. So if you're listening to a recording later, I hope you're enjoying this. They'll also all be posted on YouTube. So no matter where you are in the world, you should be able to access some of the brilliance that we've had throughout this summit. Science and spirituality, are they polar opposites, or is it that when you pick up the stick, you pick up both ends? Hopefully we've dispelled some of the myths and given you food for thought. And I think that's what Michelle and I said right in the beginning, that we didn't necessarily want you to agree with everything you heard, but we wanted you to really be curious and for it to trigger you to do some thinking for yourself. So we do hope the summit has done that for you. And as a final reminder, the summit doesn't have to end here. We have a full day immersion on the 12th of December. I know Michelle's popped a link in the chat on Facebook to join us for that immersion, and we have a very special price for that right now during the summit. So go and click on that if you want to join us and go deeper into what does this mean for you in your day-to-day life, your leadership practice, and your self-leadership. So many blessings to all of you. Go ahead, be delicious humans that you are, and thank you for tuning in wherever you are in the world. It has been our delight and pleasure. On behalf of Michelle and myself, we will continue to bring things like this to you around the world, and we send our deep gratitude to all of you. Mwah. Much love to everyone. Thanks again, Jonathan.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
Good night, everyone.